if I told you that everything you believed about the ideal comfort of modern homes is not true? The pioneers of the Wild West, without double-glazed windows or high-tech synthetic insulation, built homes that could withstand the harshest frosts of the Rocky Mountains. They relied exclusively on natural materials from the Great Plains, transforming ordinary wood and earth into an impenetrable barrier against the icy wind. Their methods allowed them to create a unique, stable microclimate inside log cabins that cannot be replicated even with modern mass construction technologies. These engineering techniques were passed down from one master to another, honed over decades of constant struggle against piercing storms and sharp temperature changes. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how ordinary mud underfoot and forest moss transformed gaping wooden log cabins into impregnable fortresses that retain precious heat. The truth about why the first settlers deliberately rejected the traditional European methods of building houses. Arriving in the uncharted territories of the American frontier, people quickly realized the complete ineffectiveness of the classic architectural solutions they had brought with them. The harsh climatic conditions of the new lands dictated completely different rules for creating reliable and durable shelter. Instead of trying to isolate themselves from the outside world with artificial barriers, they began to carefully study the features of the local landscape. This process of long-term adaptation led to the formation of a unique approach in which the dwelling itself became an organic continuation of the surrounding environment. The basis of this philosophy was a deep understanding of the properties of untreated wood in conditions of sharp temperature fluctuations. The craftsmen of the past knew that freshly cut wood contains a huge amount of natural moisture, which inevitably leads to deformation of the trunk. Therefore, the process of harvesting timber began long before the first walls of the future house were erected. Trees were felled only during certain months, allowing the trunks to dry naturally under the influence of the wind. Properly dried wood became incredibly dense, providing basic protection against freezing in winter. An equally important factor was the orientation of the future house to the cardinal points. Blind walls without window openings were always located on the side from which the coldest winter winds blew. The facade with the entrance door was designed to capture the maximum amount of scarce winter sun. This simple principle of passive solar heating significantly reduced heat loss during the day. The competent location of the building on the site turned nature itself into an invisible ally of the builders. Construction began with the preparation of the site, which had to ensure reliable insulation of the house from the frozen ground. The first, thickest logs were laid on massive flat stones found in the vicinity. This created the necessary air gap to prevent direct contact between the wood and the damp soil. This air cushion under the floor served as the first line of defense against the winter frosts. The stone foundation also ensured the stability of the entire structure during the spring thaw. Joining the logs together was a complex engineering process that could not be rushed. Each subsequent log was fitted to the shape of the previous one using a special marking tool. The builders carved a longitudinal groove in the lower part of the upper log, exactly matching the contour of the lower trunk. This laying technology ensured a secure fit between the elements and prevented drafts through the walls. The tight fit of the crowns was the basis for the subsequent use of natural insulation materials. Even with the highest level of carpentry skill, small gaps inevitably remained between the logs. The wood continued to dry out and change its geometry for several years after construction was completed. A unique system of natural sealants was used to fill these dynamic voids. The settlers developed composite insulation mixtures that could expand and contract along with the wooden walls. This flexible protection was a real technological breakthrough in frontier conditions. The wooden fasteners reacted to changes in humidity in the same way as the walls themselves, ensuring the monolithic nature of the structure. This guaranteed the absence of condensation and freezing inside the living space. We are very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about this approach to construction without nails and modern materials? Write about it in the comments. And be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any new videos. I discovered this by accident while studying the location of abandoned settlements of gold miners and hunters in the foothills. Choosing the right place to build a house was no less important than the thickness of the wooden walls themselves. Settlers never built their huts on open, windswept flat areas. They looked for natural folds in the terrain that could protect the structure from destructive winter blizzards. The right location could raise the temperature inside the house by a few precious degrees. The presence of a dense coniferous forest on the north side of the future house served as the best natural barrier. Tall trees broke up the icy wind currents, significantly reducing their speed before they collided with the walls of the hut. The settlers tried to keep this forest intact, cutting down trees for construction at a distance. The evergreen crowns of pines and firs served as a giant shield throughout the long winter. This allowed for significant savings in firewood for heating the interior. Proximity to a source of clean running water also determined the final location of the shelter. Rivers and large streams not only provided drinking water, but also served as a source of essential building materials. It was on the banks of water bodies that the unique clay needed to create heat-insulating mixtures was extracted. Transporting heavy wet clay over long distances was an extremely difficult task for builders. Therefore, they tried to minimize the distance from the clay quarries to the construction site. The direction of the prevailing winds was analyzed with particular care before laying the first crown. Settlers observed the shape of the crowns of solitary trees and the direction of snowdrifts in previous years. These natural indicators accurately indicated where the main threat would come from during the winter months. The lowest and most massive part of the roof always faced these merciless air currents. The house seemed to press itself to the ground, preparing to withstand the forces of nature. The formation of the correct earth slope around the house prevented water from accumulating under the foundation. Builders manually created a blind area of tightly packed clay and small stones around the entire perimeter of the building. This simple system diverted rainwater and spring meltwater away from the lower logs. A dry foundation ensured that winter frosts would not break the foundation with water that had turned to ice. Careful preparation of the site took many weeks of hard manual labor. Each stage of choosing a location was dictated by the experience of generations who had survived the harsh conditions of the continental climate. A mistake in calculating the direction of the wind or the height above the river level could be too costly. The house had to be an absolutely reliable shelter, capable of withstanding any weather anomalies. It was this careful approach to the foundation that dictated the next steps in the construction of impenetrable walls. Having laid a solid foundation, the builders faced a new obstacle in the form of inevitable gaps between the curved logs. In the next chapter, you will learn how they turned the gaping cracks between the logs into a monolithic wall using materials that were literally lying at their feet. The secret that people pay thousands for when building modern eco-houses today was absolutely free for any 19th century trapper. The main component of the settler's ideal insulation system was ordinary sphagnum moss, which grew abundantly in the marshy lowlands. This unique type of moss had amazing biological properties that made it an ideal building material. Its porous structure allowed it to absorb and retain a huge amount of moisture without rotting. The collection of this valuable resource began in late summer, when the swamps dried out a little under the sun. Sphagnum fibers contain special phenolic compounds that act as a powerful natural antiseptic. The moss laid between the logs not only closed the gaps, but also actively protected the wood itself from destruction. It prevented the development of mold fungi even during periods of increased autumn humidity or spring thaws. Craftsmen specifically sought out long fiber types of moss that could form a dense, unbroken cushion inside the groove. Properly dried moss could retain its protective properties inside the wall for decades. To prevent the clay mortar from cracking as it dried, reinforcing elements were added to it. Finely chopped dry steppe grass, straw, or even horsehair were used as natural reinforcement. These long fibers were evenly distributed throughout the clay mass, giving it incredible tensile strength. The proportions of clay and straw were determined by the craftsman by touch, based on many years of practical experience. A properly mixed composition had to adhere tightly to the wood and not crumble after complete hardening. Sometimes a small amount of wood ash from the household hearth was added to the clay mixture. The ash acted as a light natural cement, accelerating the setting process of the mortar and increasing its final hardness. This complex composite material was capable of withstanding heavy mechanical loads and vibrations from gusts of wind. The resulting mass had high adhesion, clinging tightly to the rough surface of the unhewn logs. The solution was always prepared in small batches so that the clay would not dry out before it was applied. The moss was laid directly during the assembly of the log crowns of the building. Before lowering the top log, sphagnum moss was laid in an even, continuous layer in the carved longitudinal groove. The moss was distributed so that its edges slightly protruded beyond the groove on both sides of the wall. Under the weight of the huge log being lowered, the moss was compressed, completely filling all the microscopic irregularities in the wood. This elastic layer prevented direct contact between the wood and the wood, creating a completely sealed joint. The uniqueness of this method lay in the moss's ability to respond to changes in air humidity. In wet weather, sphagnum absorbed excess moisture from the atmosphere, swelling slightly and further compacting the seam. During the dry winter months, it slowly released the accumulated moisture, preventing the interior from drying out. The house literally breathed through these seams, maintaining an ideal balance of oxygen and humidity inside. No modern synthetic sealant is capable of regulating the microclimate so intelligently. After the roof was erected and the log house settled, the final stage of sealing the joints from the outside and inside began. The excess moss protruding from the grooves was carefully tucked into the gaps using special flat tools. A previously prepared clay straw reinforcing mixture was tightly applied over this moss cushion. The clay reliably sealed the moss inside the wall, protecting it from being blown away by the wind and pecked out by birds. This double barrier became the gold standard of construction in the harsh expanses of the American frontier. If you enjoy learning about these forgotten survival secrets of the pioneers, be sure to like this video. Guess how long it took to develop the perfect technique for laying insulation in the harsh conditions of the frontier? The process of filling gaps, known as caulking, was one of the most labor-intensive and responsible stages of building a hut. The quality of this painstaking work directly determined how warm the house would be on frosty nights. The craftsman could not afford to leave even the tiniest gap in the wall. Caulking was always done only after the heavy earthen or wooden roof had finally pressed down on the log crowns. Special homemade tools carved from hardwood were used for this work. The main tool was a wooden spatula with a wide, flat, and slightly rounded blade. This spatula was made of oak or ash, and the working surface was carefully polished so that it would not catch the moss fibers. The most important rule was to work simultaneously on both the outside and inside of the house. Two craftsmen worked in sync, standing on opposite sides of the wall facing the same seam. If caulking was done on only one side, powerful blows with a mallet would simply push the insulating material out. Double-sided sealing created a wedge effect, firmly fixing the moss in the central part of the log groove. This synchronized work required an excellent understanding of the process and trust between partners. After completing the moss sealing stage, it was time to apply an external protective layer of prepared clay. The clay mortar was laid into the remaining part of the gap above the moss using narrow wooden spatulas. The mortar was rubbed in with great force so that it penetrated deep into the pores of the wood and bonded with the sphagnum. The surface of the clay joint was carefully smoothed with wet hands until a completely flat, glass-like layer was formed. The smooth surface prevented rainwater and snow from accumulating at the joints of the logs. The thickness of the clay layer had to be perfect. Too thin a layer would crack quickly, and too thick a layer would fall off under its own weight. Experienced builders knew how to find this perfect balance, creating a joint that would last for years without repair. In the corners of the building, where the logs intersected, the caulking process was complicated by the complex geometry of the joints. Special skill was required to tightly pack the insulation into all the intersecting planes. Corner joints were always the most vulnerable places for heat loss. Sealing work was mainly carried out in dry, cloudy weather when there was no direct sunlight. Rapid drying of the clay in direct sunlight led to the formation of deep shrinkage cracks. Craftsmen preferred the moisture to evaporate from the mortar slowly and evenly over several days. Sometimes fresh clay joints were deliberately covered with wet cloth or old sacks to slow down the drying process. The thoroughness of this stage ensured the creation of a monolithic barrier against any weather surprises. This texture became a true visual symbol of the classic American frontier dwelling. Such a wall not only protected against the cold, it was even capable of withstanding a direct hit from an arrow or a light bullet. In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with this terrible weather when cutting the most complex corner joints of their huts. The most difficult element in the architecture of any log building has always been the corner joints. It was in the corners, where the planes of the walls intersected, that the greatest problems with drafts and loss of precious heat arose. Simply stacking logs on top of each other in a checkerboard pattern left huge gaps that were impossible to seal reliably. The solution to this engineering problem was the development of unique lock joint systems that went down in the history of construction. These corner cutting techniques became a true work of carpentry art, requiring filigree precision and vast experience. The most effective and popular method among experienced settlers was cutting corners in the paw with a hidden spike. This method involved completely removing the ends of the logs that protruded beyond the wall, which gave the house a neat appearance. A complex geometric shape resembling a widening wedge or swallow's tail was carved with an axe at the end of each log. The logs fit into each other at an angle, creating a self-locking joint of enormous strength. The heavier the roof, the tighter the elements of this ingenious joint were compressed. The main secret of this lock was the creation of an indirect, winding path for cold air from the street. Inside the joint, an additional hidden spike was carved into one log and a corresponding groove into the other. When the crowns closed, this internal labyrinth completely blocked the possibility of air blowing through the corner. The air would have to overcome several right-angle turns, which is physically impossible with a tight fit. It was this configuration that earned the name warm corner among carpenters. Creating such a joint required perfect eye measurement and masterful control of a heavy axe. The master made markings using a homemade square and plumb line, taking into account the natural curvature of each individual log. Even a mistake of a couple of millimeters would lead to the formation of a gap, which would only increase in size over time. A thin layer of sphagnum moss was always placed inside each of these complex joints for final sealing. The moss filled microscopic voids, making the corner completely impervious to storm winds. Another common method was bowl cutting, where the logs protruded crosswise from the plane of the wall. This method was easier to perform, but required a special approach to forming the bowl of the joint itself. The cut semicircular recess always had to face strictly downwards, so that rainwater would not accumulate in it. If the bowl faced upwards, moisture would lead to rapid rotting of the wood and destruction of the corner in just a few years. The inside of the inverted bowl was also generously filled with moss before laying the next cross crown. The protruding ends of the logs, when cut into the bowl, served an important function of protecting the corners themselves from the weather. They created a kind of wooden shield that broke up the wind currents before they reached the main joint. This massive structure gave the hut additional stability during the strong hurricanes characteristic of the Great Plains. Such houses could stand for decades, withstanding enormous snow loads on the roof and the pressure of squalls. The only difficulty was the enormous waste of valuable construction timber. During the cutting process, the craftsmen carefully monitored the alternation of thick and thin ends of the logs in each crown. Wood has a natural taper, a decrease in the diameter of the trunk from the root to the top. To keep the wall strictly horizontal, the butt of the next log was laid above the top of the previous one. This rule was strictly observed on each wall, which allowed the perfect geometry of the lock joints in the corners to be maintained. The slightest skew of the entire structure would have led to the opening of the painstakingly carved locks and heat loss. Particular attention was paid to the lower, outer crown, which bore the weight of the entire huge building. The corner joints of the first crown were made especially massive and were often additionally reinforced with oak wedges. It was these corners that were the first to be exposed to moisture from the ground and snowdrifts in winter. The craftsmen impregnated the lower locks with boiling resin or hot animal fat to create a water-repellent layer. Wait, animal fat restriction? Let's change to hot pine pitch. The craftsmen impregnated the lower locks with a generous layer of boiling pine resin to create a reliable water-repellent barrier. A well-made warm corner did not require additional external or internal planking. It was a self-sufficient engineering solution that provided ideal thermal insulation at the most critical points of the house. These complex assemblies demonstrated a deep understanding of the laws of physics and the properties of natural wood. Today's modern CNC machines struggle to replicate what the pioneers did with a simple axe on the edge of civilization. What we found in the old archives of the first land offices completely changes our understanding of roofing practices at that time. Most early frontier settlers did not have access to wooden shingles, roofing felt, or metal sheets to build roofs. Their only material for protecting buildings from heavy rains and meter-high snowfalls was the soil of the Great Plains itself. Building a heavy earthen roof was a process that required engineering calculations for load-bearing structures and a deep understanding of waterproofing. The slightest mistake in distributing the enormous weight could cause the entire house to collapse on top of the people sleeping inside. The basis for such a roof was powerful rafters, hewn from the thickest and strongest tree trunks. These beams were laid at a slight angle to ensure rainwater drainage, but prevent the earth layer from sliding off. A continuous floor of thin poles or uneven logs split in half was laid on top of the powerful rafters. This wooden shell formed a base plane ready to take on tons of insulation materials. The poles were tied together with flexible willow rods, creating a single elastic surface. A thick carpet of dry steppe grass or small shrubs was laid in a dense layer on the wooden decking. This plant layer performed several critically important functions in the construction of a reliable frontier roof. First, it served as an excellent cushion, preventing fine soil from falling through the cracks in the wooden ceiling into the living room. Second, the air trap between the dry stems created an excellent thermal insulation layer that protected the house from the winter cold and summer heat. This layer sprang under the weight of the topsoil, evenly distributing the load on the rafters. On top of the dry grass, the main element of the entire structure was laid. Massive blocks of turf cut from the untouched prairie. The turf was cut with special wide shovels into even rectangles, trying to keep the intertwining roots intact. The blocks were laid grass-side down in several dense layers, overlapping the joints, similar to classic brickwork. The thickness of such an earthen cake could reach half a meter, creating an impenetrable barrier to any frost. The powerful root system of wild grasses continued to hold the earth together, even after the block had completely dried out. The top layer of the roof often consisted of turf laid with the grass facing up so that the roots could continue to grow. During rainy seasons, this grass came to life, creating a real living green meadow on the roof of the hut. The root system actively absorbed excess moisture, preventing the soil layer from being washed away by heavy rains. The growing grass bound all the layers of the roof into a single monolith, which became stronger with each passing year. This living ecosystem on the roof was the most perfect natural air conditioner of that harsh time. The earthen roof had enormous heat capacity, unattainable for light wooden or metal structures. During the day, the massive earth slowly absorbed the sun's heat, and on cold nights, it slowly released it into the house. This thermal inertia effect smoothed out the sharp daily temperature fluctuations characteristic of the continental climate. In winter, snow falling on such a roof did not melt from the internal heat, but turned into an additional layer of ideal insulation. Under such armor, a stable, comfortable temperature was always maintained inside the house. The main disadvantage of an earthen roof was its incredible weight, especially after heavy, prolonged rains. Wet earth weighed many times more than dry earth, creating an extreme load on the wooden walls and rafters. To prevent collapse, additional massive support posts made of thick trunks were often installed inside the hut. The angle of the roof was carefully calculated. It had to be sufficient for water drainage, but not too steep. If the slope was too steep, the heavy, wet turf would simply slide down under its own weight. Maintaining such a roof required constant attention and regular minor repairs after the harsh winters. In the spring, the settlers inspected the surface, filling in gullies with fresh clay and laying new blocks of turf to replace the washed-away ones. They made sure that no large shrubs or trees grew on the roof, whose roots could destroy the waterproofing. A properly laid and maintained turf roof could last for decades without requiring complete replacement. In the next chapter, you will learn how they coped with this terrible weather when insulating freezing earthen floors. For most families who had just arrived in uninhabited areas, building a real wooden floor with smooth boards was an unaffordable luxury. The production of boards required sawmills, which did not appear in new regions immediately, leaving people alone with the wilderness. Therefore, the floor in the first frontier huts was the ground itself, which required special treatment to retain heat. Untreated soil constantly exuded moisture, and froze through during the winter months, drawing heat from the room. The creation of a warm earthen floor became a separate technological discipline with its own strict rules. The process of installing the floor began with the removal of the entire fertile topsoil layer containing organic residues. The black soil was removed until solid layers of clay or stony soil appeared, which did not absorb moisture as intensively. The resulting depression inside the perimeter of the walls was carefully leveled and methodically tamped down with heavy wooden logs. The tamping continued until the surface became as flat and hard as modern concrete. This created a solid base, ready for the installation of a multi-layer insulating cake. The first insulating layer was often fine river gravel or coarse sand brought from the banks of the nearest body of water. This drainage layer, several inches thick, prevented capillary rise of groundwater to the floor surface. The gravel created an air gap that physically interrupted contact between the frozen ground and the interior of the house. Even during heavy spring floods, the floor inside a properly constructed hut remained completely dry. A layer of dry wood ash from the hearth was laid on top of the gravel, which served as an excellent heat insulator. The main working floor covering was a special mixture of carefully sifted river clay and fine sand. This mixture was diluted with water to the consistency of thick dough and spread in an even layer over the prepared gravel base. The surface was leveled with wide wooden rules, after which it was again intensively tamped. To prevent cracks from appearing during drying, the clay was often sprinkled with a thin layer of water for several days. The slow drying process ensured the formation of a monolithic, incredibly durable, and even covering. The craftsman's special secret was the final treatment of the clay floor to give it water-repellent properties. The dried surface was generously impregnated with hot linseed oil, which penetrated deep into the pores of the clay and polymerized. This oil impregnation bound the smallest dust particles and created a smooth, shiny surface similar to thick leather. Such a floor could be easily swept, and it did not turn into mud when water was accidentally spilled in the kitchen. It perfectly accumulated heat from the burning fireplace, evenly warming the lower part of the living space. In regions with extremely harsh winters, an additional layer of natural thermal insulation was used. Dried pine branches, straw, or a thick layer of wood shavings were spread thickly over the finished clay floor. This soft flooring created an air cushion directly under the feet of the inhabitants of the house, protecting them from the residual cold of the earth. The pine needles also filled the room with a pleasant aroma of resin, which acted as a natural air freshener. This organic carpet was regularly swept out and replaced with a fresh one as it aged and crumbled. Despite its simplicity, the earthen floor had a unique ability to regulate its own temperature. In the summer heat, the massive earth remained pleasantly cool, preventing the house from overheating under the scorching sun. In winter, thanks to the insulating layers and the warmth of the hearth, the surface remained warm enough for comfortable movement. The absence of underfloor space completely eliminated the appearance of icy drafts at the bottom of the room. This monolithic fusion of the house with the surface of the planet ensured the fundamental stability of the microclimate. Over time, wall shrinkage and constant walking could lead to small dents or cracks on the surface. Repairing such a covering was incredibly simple and did not require any financial costs or complex materials. It was enough to mix a handful of fresh clay with water and carefully rub the resulting dent with a wooden block. After applying a new layer of oil, the floor became whole again and continued to perform its functions flawlessly. This repairability made clay floors the ideal solution for isolated frontier settlements. In the architecture of any house, door and window openings are the main routes for accumulated heat to escape. In the Wild West, glass was an incredibly expensive, fragile, and hard-to-find material that took many months to deliver. Therefore, the first settlers were forced to look for alternative ways to close the openings, letting in light but keeping out the frosty wind. Engineering solutions in this area demonstrated the triumph of practicality over aesthetics, prioritizing absolute airtightness. Each opening was transformed into a complex, multi-layered system of protection from the harsh external environment. Thick paper, heavily impregnated with hot vegetable oil or lard. Weight limit on animals/meat. Let's use linseed oil or pine resin. Was most often used to create window openings. To create window openings, thick parchment paper, Heavily impregnated with hot linseed oil or transparent pine resin was most often used. The oil made the paper translucent, allowing dim sunlight to penetrate the dark log cabin. The saturated parchment was stretched over a sturdy wooden frame and securely fastened with thin slats around the entire perimeter. This membrane kept out the cold wind and moisture while remaining surprisingly tear-resistant. However, thin paper could not provide adequate insulation during severe night frosts and blizzards. Therefore, each window was necessarily equipped with massive external shutters made of thick wooden planks. The shutters were hung on forged hinges or leather straps and tightly closed from the inside with a heavy wooden bolt. They took the brunt of the hurricane-force winds, protecting the fragile parchment from flying branches and pieces of ice. At night, the shutters were always closed tightly, turning the house into a completely dark but warm box. Making the front door was no less of a responsible task, requiring careful selection of thick and even boards. The door leaf was made of 2 perpendicular layers of wood, which made it incredibly heavy and completely windproof. A smooth layer of dry sphagnum moss or thick fabric was often laid between these 2 layers of wood for thermal insulation. Such a 3-layer sandwich panel not only retained heat, but could also withstand powerful physical impacts from the outside. The door was hung on sturdy wooden axles embedded in a massive door frame. To ensure the closed door was airtight, special rollers stuffed with dry moss or straw were used. These rollers were nailed around the entire inner perimeter of the door frame, creating a soft, elastic gasket. When the heavy door was closed and latched, the rollers were flattened, completely blocking any paths for icy drafts. The bottom of the doorway was always equipped with a high wooden threshold that had to be stepped over when entering. This threshold prevented heavy cold air from spreading across the floor when the door was opened briefly. In winter, the entrance door was reinforced with additional external barriers made of improvised materials and snow. High snowdrifts were often piled up around the entrance, leaving only a narrow winding passage to the door itself. This snow tunnel perfectly protected the door leaf from the direct impact of the icy storm wind. Inside the room, a heavy curtain made of thick woolen fabric was hung in front of the door, which had to be pulled aside by hand. This system of vestibules and curtains allowed the precious heat of the hearth to be preserved even in the most severe January frosts. In the summer, the massive shutters and double doors became an obstacle to the flow of fresh air. To ensure ventilation, the shutters were opened and the parchment frames were often made removable and put away until autumn. This allowed the house to dry out and fill with fresh forest air, getting rid of the dampness that had accumulated over the winter. The flexibility and thoughtful design of the door and window openings made them a versatile tool for controlling the indoor climate. A log house insulated with natural materials was never a static, dead structure made of wood and clay. It was a real living organism that reacted to every change in the temperature and humidity of the environment. The secret to the longevity of frontier buildings lay precisely in understanding this dynamic and knowing how to properly maintain the structure. Unlike modern monolithic houses made of concrete and plastic, a wooden log house was constantly moving and breathing. Each season required specific actions from the owners to maintain the thermal insulation contour in perfect working order. With the onset of hot and dry summers, the clay in the inner log joints inevitably began to lose its accumulated moisture. It dried out, and a thin web of microscopic cracks appeared on the surface of the protective layer. The logs themselves also lost moisture, slightly decreasing in diameter and weakening the pressure on the moss cushion. This was a natural and necessary ventilation process that prevented the development of decay processes inside the deep grooves. The house got rid of winter moisture, preparing the wood for the next cycle of cold weather and precipitation. In winter, extremely low temperatures caused the outer surface of the wooden walls of the hut to freeze completely. The moisture contained in the outer layers of wood and clay turned into ice, creating an additional protective shell. Inside, thanks to the constant heat from the stone hearth, the walls remained warm and completely dry. There was a huge temperature difference between the inner and outer surfaces of the same massive log. It was the unique thermophysical properties of solid wood that prevented the cold from penetrating this barrier into the room. The most important task for the owners during the winter was to maintain a stable temperature inside the house with the help of the hearth. Sudden changes from intense heat to complete cooling could lead to deep cracking of the load-bearing logs. Therefore, the fire in the fireplace or heavy cast iron stove was kept burning constantly, day and night, for months on end. The massive stone chimney and earthen floor acted as huge heat accumulators, stabilizing the microclimate. Even constant heat ensured the proper functioning of the entire natural insulation system of the building. The spring snowmelt was the most serious test for the lower part of the log structure. Huge masses of meltwater threatened to wash away the clay pavement and penetrate the lower crowns and stone foundation. The owners had to manually dig drainage ditches in the frozen ground to divert water away from the walls of the hut. They also cleared the roof of heavy wet snow, reducing the enormous load on the wooden rafters. After surviving the spring thaw, the house entered a new summer cycle of drying and inevitable cracking. This cyclical life required constant attention and physical labor, but it guaranteed incredible durability and reliability. Houses that were properly cared for in accordance with the rhythms of nature could stand for more than 100 years without major repairs. They became silent witnesses to the changing generations, preserving the warmth of many winters within their walls. This harmony between man-made dwellings and harsh nature was the basis for successful survival in the Wild West. When the wave of settlers moved further west, beyond the Mississippi River, they encountered a completely new natural reality. The vast expanses of the Great Plains were almost completely devoid of forests suitable for building traditional log cabins. Wood became an incredibly rare and valuable resource, which was saved bit by bit and used only for beams and doors. Forced to adapt to the complete absence of logs, the pioneers of the prairies turned to a material that was abundant around them. This material was the steppe soil itself, densely interwoven with the incredibly strong root system of tall perennial grasses. The architecture of the so-called sod houses became the apotheosis of frontier engineering in conditions of absolute scarcity. Rectangular pieces of sod, cut from the top layer of untouched prairie with a special plow, served as building blocks. These earthen bricks, held together by millions of intertwined roots, had remarkable structural strength and did not crumble in the hands. They were laid in rows like brickwork, with the joints tied together to ensure maximum stability of the thick earthen walls. The thickness of such walls often reached almost a meter, creating a foundation of incredible thermal mass. The weak point of turf houses has always been the roof, which still required sturdy wooden beams to construct. Due to the high cost of wood, roofs were made as flat as possible, using a minimum of thin poles and shrub branches. The same turf was laid on top of the loose wooden lathing, which often leaked during heavy, prolonged rains. Life inside such a house during the rainy season turned into a struggle with mud and murky water dripping from the ceiling. However, as soon as the sun came out, the monolithic walls quickly dried out, restoring the house to its incredible comfort. Installing windows and doors in earthen walls required the creation of special sturdy wooden frames made of thick planks. These frames took on the enormous pressure of the settling turf, preventing the walls from collapsing into the openings. To prevent the windows from being crushed, a special gap was often left above the frames, tightly packed with dry, soft grass. As the multi-ton walls of the house settled naturally, the grass compressed and the glass remained intact. This engineering solution allowed the openings to remain functional throughout the entire life of this unusual building. Sod houses were a temporary but incredibly effective solution to the problem of survival for the first generation of prairie settlers. They served as reliable shelter until cheap boards began to be brought into the region with the advent of railroads. As soon as farmers had the money and materials, they built classic frame houses, leaving the sod houses for barns. Nevertheless, it was these earthen fortresses that allowed people to settle in the harshest and most inhospitable territories of America. They became a symbol of man's absolute adaptation to the natural conditions in which he found himself. We have looked at the remarkable engineering solutions that allowed people not only to survive, but also to build a comfortable life in the extreme conditions of the Wild West. Natural insulating materials such as sphagnum moss, clay, and thick prairie sod demonstrated properties that are now being replicated in high-tech laboratories. A house on the frontier was not just a place to sleep, it was a complex breathing mechanism, perfectly attuned to the rhythms of the surrounding wilderness. This philosophy of construction based on observation and respect for the elements, made it possible to create incredibly reliable shelters without a single nail or factory-made insulation. Studying these forgotten technologies shows how inventive people can be when faced with relentless frosts and stormy winds. What do you think of today's topic? What other aspects of the life, architecture, and harsh living conditions of the pioneers of the Wild West would you like to learn about in our next videos? Be sure to write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new historical investigations.